Welcome back. Okay, you saw the figures are fully painted, but they're not really done yet. You know that you have to mount them on a base. You should paint the base, flock the base, put some texture on the base, and what I do is I actually dip the figures. It's not physically dipping them in anything, it's just called dipping. It's kind of like more like a resin wash, polyurethane wash, and I'll go over that in a minute. But on this video, what we're going to do is we're going to have basing, base texturing, base painting, and then we will dip them once the, well actually we're going to dip them before we do the texturing. Okay, so we're going to dip them. All of this process is the longest process and takes the longest amount of time only because I have to wait for it to dry. It only takes minutes to do it, but then you got to let it sit off to you put them off and then come back at it to the next day. So this video will be filmed over the course of multiple days because I will have to I will have to wait, wait for the paint to dry. You know what I mean? Watch the grass grow. No, seriously. All right, now one of my first steps, you see the 12 figures I've got painted there. Speaking of 12 figures, I just got my new British Grenadier book in today, and when I got it in, I looked at Freeman's Farm, which is the scenario that I'm doing the 20th for, and it says I need 20 figures. Oh no, it doesn't. It says I need 16 figures for this. So what does that mean? I mean I'm going to have to break out 4 more figures and paint them. But okay, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to leave them at 12 and add a base later. Okay, well what do? We pop them off the popsicle sticks. Not hard to do at all. Pop. Okay, maybe it is hard to do. That guy didn't want to come off. I might have put too much Elmer's on this guy. Okay. Plus, when I spray painted it, the fusion helps seal the model, but it also helps seal the figure onto the popsicle stick. Okay, so what do? I take a base, right, and I have these cut to size. In this scenario, I am using metal bases, and I've put a little bit of a foam tacky rubber on the bottom to give it some kind of depth, so it's about an 1/8 of an inch thick. I'm using Elmer's Glue All Max, and again I'm only putting drops. Well, that's okay. Okay, now with my British, you know that you have a drummer, a leader, a standard bearer, a regimental standard bearer, and a king's guidon. I guess the national colors. What I like to do is put the flags alternating, like one in the front, one behind. I like to put a drummer in the back because he's not really in charge, and I'll put whoever I'm planning on having as my officer, which is really just this sergeant, and I have him stand in front. Pretty simple, isn't it? Okay, you see them mounted on the base. Now, what am I doing now? I'm waiting for that glue to dry before I add the next step. Okay, a lot of models you'll see will have these bases as part, okay, I don't know if you can see that, but okay, these bases as part of the model, and then when you glue it to a flat base, like for maneuvering your figures or your units, it makes them look like every one of these models are standing on their own little hill or their own little slate rock or whatever. And so what I do is I fill in all the gaps around the figures with spackling, and it levels everything out. And I'll show you that in just a second. This step, the step I have come up to now, is after we glue the figures to the base and we allow that glue to dry. We get 4 figures to a base, they're glued down, and they're on the base. Okay. Now, some of you out there probably game by either just putting flock directly on your base, or you'll paint the base and then just flock that, or you will paint the base, apply flock to the paint, or you will paint the base, let it dry, apply some glue, apply some rocks or whatever. Okay, well, let me show you what I do. And I probably mentioned this before, and here's my stick, which you probably previously saw me use to stir my paint in my palettes. This is a metallic base. This could be a wooden base. This could be a card base. Whatever you're using for your bases. I use metallics or Litco plywood bases because they don't warp when you get them, when you put glue on them, or if you put this spackling on there. Okay, now what I do, if you notice, each of these figures is on a little mound. It's called their base. Each one has their own little base. Okay, these bases stick up about, I don't know, 1/16 of an inch. But what it looks like is each one of these figures is standing on its own personal mound. So what I do to balance that out is I take spackling. I use dry decks. Okay. DAP's dry decks spackling, and what I do is that I apply it to the base in between the figures, and I leave it rough and contoured so that when it dries it looks like it's uneven ground. It's not perfect. The world is not perfect. Okay, so if you want to watch, I will zoom this in and you can see what I'm doing. Okay. I use, on these sticks, they have like a flat, they have a point that I use to mix, knowing that I'm going to use the backside as my little scooper, I don't know what you would call it, applicator. Okay. My hand in the way? Yeah. Okay, now once this is applied, you have to wait for it to dry. Dry Decks has a mixture that goes on pink and dries white, kind of gives you a clue on what time it's done drying. Well, this looks awful white already. Well, that's because it's old, and I think the pink is kind of sunk to the bottom of my bucket. But it doesn't affect the spackling at all. I just have to physically wait for it to dry. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said, the world is not perfect, so you want it to have a little bit of a contour to it, little bumps and ridges, and nothing to be perfectly smooth like the base was before you did this. Okay, now I make sure that I have some of my spackle bleed over on top of their personal little bases to make their bases not so perfectly flat and round. Okay, and then what I do is I coat the base with spackling, and then I let that dry, and then I'll get right back to you. Alright, the next step is probably one of the most important steps of this whole process. The whole reason for this video was basically for me to boil down to this step, which is the dipping step. Okay, and I use, like I said, Minwax poly shades right there. I'm using an antique walnut right there. I don't want it to be too dark because then it would ruin the paint job that I'm using. But I also don't want it to be too light. Like, why bother if it's going to be too light? So I use the Minwax stain and polyurethane. Now, Ace Hardware has a stain polyurethane mix. I'm sure it works just as fine, just as good. I just haven't used it. I've always used Minwax. Okay. Before you use Minwax, I want to let you know that this is an oil-based compound. So to clean any tools that you have, you will need to get some turpentine or acetone. I'm using acetone right here. I use an old brush that I don't care about anymore. It's one that's gone the way of the dodo. It's got really stiff bristles because I've used Minwax on it before, and you can never clean it all off, so there's a little bit of residue, and that little bit of residue is always gunking up the brush. So this is the horrible brush that I use. Okay, so you need a cup for your acetone other than your soap and water. You'll need acetone itself, you'll need Minwax, and of course you'll need your painted figures. Shake it up well. You're going to probably have air bubbles. I don't care. Air bubbles are inconsequential. No big deal. Bust out my little can opening tool. Come off, because, you know, if you play a miniature game, you always handle your figures. You also have friends or family, or, you know, you go to competitions or any other kind of conventions or whatever, and all these people you don't even know are handling your figures. So you want to make sure your figures are protected. There we go. Perfect. Now, what I do is I do paint liberally onto these figures. I could, technically, if I had a big enough can, I could take my figure and just dunk them in there, and that's why it's called dipping. But I don't do that. I actually judiciously apply it to the figure with this brush, like I said, and then when it sits there drying, it doesn't, what happens is it kind of runs down the figure, and then around the feet it will pool up. Well, I don't care if it pools up, because once all the polyurethane's dry, and once the base putty, or what do you call it, the spackle is dry, I go back over and I paint the spackle and any drippage that might be. So let me show you. Let's start with one of the figures, one of the bases. See, I put it on the white pants, and it totally looks brown now, right? Don't panic. Okay, I should say, when it drips down the figure, it will pool up in the cracks and crevices of the figure. And when it does that, it basically will it'll enhance that black spacing that I had done throughout my paint job, and it will make the shadows blend. So basically you'll have kind of a blended look. Everything will... This is basically my secret. You do this and your paint job it'll make it look like you're an expert painter. It covers up all your imperfections. Now, a lot of you probably use flesh washes, right, to get the shadows in the hands and the faces and things like that. Well, when you do the dip, if you noticed, when I painted the figures, I didn't even bother with the flesh wash, because this acts as my flesh wash. And I'm getting it all over my fingers, just like that, you know. Don't worry about it. It comes off. So let me show you what it looks like dipped. See, it ran all over the base. That's totally acceptable. I'm going to pick this thing up from the bottom. I'm going to let you guys see what's going on. As of right now, it's completely dipped, and we're just waiting for it to dry. It's going to take about 24 hours for this to dry, or it'll be sticky. You got to wait till it dries and it's not sticky anymore. And I'll see you tomorrow.